Alexander Blackwood had ruled the vampire kingdom for over 3 centuries, his dark castle perched on the highest peak of the mountains. His reputation as a ruthless and powerful vampire king spread fear across both the mortal and immortal realms. Yet beneath his cold exterior, Alexander harbored secrets that could destroy everything he had built. The castle employed dozens of human servants, all bound by ancient contracts that ensured their silence and loyalty. Among them was Emma, a young Irish woman who had arrived at the castle 6 months ago, desperate for work after losing her family to a plague that swept through her village. At 22, Emma possessed a rare combination of courage and compassion that set her apart from the other servants. Emma worked as Alexander's personal maid, responsible for maintaining his private chambers, preparing his evening attire, and ensuring his quarters remained pristine during his daily rest. The other servants whispered that she was either incredibly brave or foolishly naive to work so closely with the vampire king. They told stories of previous maids who had mysteriously disappeared, though Emma had never witnessed any evidence of such tales. Alexander's daily routine was rigid and predictable. Each dawn, as the first rays of sunlight threatened to breach the heavy curtains of his chamber, he would retire to his ornate coffin carved from ancient oak and lined with crimson velvet. The other servants believed he slept deeply during these daylight hours, vulnerable and unaware of the world around him. This belief had become so ingrained in castle life that the daylight hours were considered the safest time for the human staff to move freely throughout the fortress. What none of them knew was that Alexander had developed an extraordinary ability over his centuries of existence. Through years of meditation and supernatural discipline, he had learned to remain conscious while appearing to be in the deep slumber that typically claimed vampires during daylight hours. His breathing would slow to an almost imperceptible rate. His body would become still as stone, and to any observer, he appeared to be in the death-like sleep that protected vampires from the sun's deadly rays. This deception served multiple purposes. It allowed Alexander to gather intelligence about his servants, his enemies, and potential threats to his kingdom. He had discovered several assassination attempts this way, thwarted rebellions among his vampire subjects, and learned valuable information about the mortal world that helped him maintain his power. Most importantly, it let him observe the true nature of those around him when they believed themselves unobserved. Emma had quickly established herself as different from the other servants. While most hurried through their duties in Alexander's chamber, eager to leave as quickly as possible, Emma took her time. She cleaned with meticulous care, arranged his belongings with respect rather than fear, and even spoke softly to herself as she worked, as if keeping herself company in the imposing room. During her first week, Alexander had expected Emma to steal something valuable, attempt to drive a stake through his heart, or at least search through his personal belongings out of curiosity. Instead, she simply performed her duties with a dedication that surprised him. She dusted every surface twice, ensured his clothes were perfectly arranged, and even noticed when small details were out of place, correcting them without being asked. As weeks passed, Alexander found himself looking forward to Emma's presence in his chamber. Her soft humming while she worked created an oddly comforting atmosphere in the otherwise cold and forbidding room. She had a habit of talking to herself, and through these one-sided conversations, Alexander learned about her life, her fears, her hopes, and her surprisingly philosophical outlook on existence. Emma often spoke about her lost family, her memories of Ireland, and her thoughts about life in the castle. She never expressed hatred or fear toward Alexander, which puzzled him greatly. Most humans who knew his true nature either cowered in terror or burned with hatred. Emma seemed to view him as simply another being trying to exist in a complicated world. One particular morning, about 3 months into Emma's employment, she had entered his chamber as usual but seemed troubled. As she cleaned, she spoke more to herself than usual, revealing concerns about another servant named who had been making unwanted advances toward her. Worked in the castle's lower levels and had been pressuring Emma to accept his romantic pursuits, despite her clear rejections. Alexander felt an unexpected surge of protective anger as he listened to Emma's worried whispers. The feeling surprised him greatly, as he had not experienced such emotions toward a human in over a century. He made a mental note to address behavior, though he would have to do so carefully to avoid revealing his ability to remain conscious during daylight hours. The next day, mysteriously found himself assigned to work in the castle's most remote tower, far from the main living quarters and Emma's daily routine. When he complained to the head butler, James, he was told that the vampire king himself had specifically requested the reassignment. Never bothered Emma again, though she never learned the true reason for his sudden transfer. This incident marked a turning point in Alexander's perception of Emma. He began to realize that his interest in her went beyond mere curiosity about human nature. For the first time in centuries, he found himself caring about another beings, a development that both intrigued and alarmed him. Emma, meanwhile, remained unaware of Alexander's unusual sleeping habits or his growing interest in her welfare. She continued her duties with the same dedication, gradually becoming more comfortable in the Vampire King's presence. She had even begun to feel a strange sympathy for him, sensing a loneliness in his grand but empty chambers that resonated with her own feelings of isolation in the strange castle. The castle's head butler, James, was a tall, stern man in his 50s who had served the Blackwood family for over 30 years. He managed the human staff with military precision and maintained the delicate balance between serving a vampire master and protecting the human servants under his care. James had noticed Emma's unusual composure around their supernatural employer and had quietly approved of her assignment to Alexander's personal quarters. Among the other servants, Emma had formed a friendship with Sarah Martinez, a Spanish woman who worked in the castle's extensive kitchen. Sarah was a few years older than Emma and had been at the castle for 2 years. She often warned Emma about the dangers of working so closely with Alexander, sharing the various legends and rumors that circulated among the staff about previous servants who had supposedly vanished or met terrible fates. Emma listened to these warnings with patience, but never seemed particularly frightened. She would often respond that she had yet to see any evidence of cruelty from Alexander, and that perhaps the stories were exaggerated over time. This attitude both impressed and worried Sarah, who genuinely cared about Emma's safety but couldn't understand her fearless approach to their dangerous employer. Doctor, the castle's physician, was another important figure in the servants' lives. A middle-aged Irish woman who had arrived at the castle years before Emma, Doctor provided medical care for the human staff and maintained a careful balance in her relationship with Alexander. She was one of the few servants who interacted directly with the Vampire King when he was awake, as she occasionally needed to discuss health matters affecting the castle's human population. Doctor had observed Emma's integration into castle life with professional interest. She noted that Emma showed no signs of the stress, fear, or psychological trauma that often affected servants who worked in close proximity to supernatural beings. Instead, Emma seemed to adapt remarkably well to her unusual circumstances, maintaining her mental and physical health better than many long-term castle residents. The castle itself was a character in Emma's daily life. Built centuries ago, it contained hundreds of rooms, secret passages, hidden chambers, and architectural features that seemed to shift and change depending on lighting and perspective. Emma had gradually learned to navigate its complexities, discovering shortcuts through lesser-known corridors and developing an almost intuitive sense of the building's layout. Alexander's personal chambers occupied an entire floor of the castle's highest tower. The rooms were furnished with priceless antiques, rare artworks, and artifacts collected over centuries of existence. His bedroom, where Emma spent most of her working hours, contained the ornate coffin that served as his resting place, massive wardrobes filled with elegant clothing from different historical periods, and tall windows that remained heavily curtained during daylight hours. The coffin itself was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, carved with intricate designs that told the story of Alexander's lineage and achievements. Emma had initially been nervous about working around such an obvious symbol of his vampire nature, but she had gradually become comfortable with its presence. She cleaned around it carefully, ensuring that dust never accumulated on its polished surface, treating it with the same respect she showed all of Alexander's possessions. As autumn approached, marking Emma's 6th month at the castle, she had established herself as an indispensable member of the household staff. Her work was impeccable, her demeanor remained consistently positive, and she had somehow managed to earn the respect of both the human servants and the few vampire nobles who occasionally visited Alexander's court. What Emma didn't know was that Alexander had begun to struggle with his feelings toward her. His centuries of emotional detachment were being challenged by her constant presence, her gentle nature, and her complete lack of fear or hatred toward him. He found himself looking forward to her daily visits to his chamber, hanging on every word of her soft conversations with herself, and feeling genuinely concerned about her. This internal conflict was something entirely new for Alexander. As a vampire king, he was accustomed to commanding absolute authority, inspiring fear and respect in equal measure, and maintaining emotional distance from all other beings. The idea that a human servant could affect him so profoundly was both fascinating and deeply troubling. Alexander had also noticed that Emma's behavior in his chamber had evolved over the months. Initially, she had worked in relative silence, speaking only occasionally and keeping her conversations brief. Recently, however, she had become more talkative, sharing more personal thoughts and observations as she worked. It was as if she had come to view his sleeping form as a safe confidant, someone who couldn't judge her thoughts or use her words against her. The irony of this situation was not lost on Alexander. Emma felt safe sharing her innermost thoughts precisely because she believed he couldn't hear them, while in reality, every word she spoke was adding to his growing fascination with her character and personality. One particular afternoon in late October, Emma entered Alexander's chamber carrying fresh linens and her usual cleaning supplies. The autumn sunlight filtered weakly through the heavy curtains, casting the room in a dim, golden glow that seemed to soften the otherwise imposing atmosphere. As she worked, Emma began talking about a book she had been reading in her spare time, a collection of poetry by William Butler Yeats that she had discovered in the castle's vast library. She recited several lines from memory, her voice carrying a musical quality that filled the silent chamber with unexpected warmth. Alexander found himself captivated not just by the beauty of the poetry, but by the passion and intelligence with which Emma delivered the verses. He realized that he had severely underestimated her education and intellectual depth. Here was a woman who had lost everything, taken a position as a servant in a vampire's castle out of desperation, yet still found time to read poetry and contemplate the deeper meanings of existence. As Emma continued her work, she began to speak more personally about the poems, relating them to her own experiences of loss, hope, and the search for meaning in difficult circumstances. Her insights were profound and moving, revealing a philosophical depth that impressed Alexander greatly. For the first time in his long existence, Alexander found himself wishing he could respond to someone's thoughts, engage in conversation about literature and philosophy, share his own centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience. The realization that he genuinely wanted to connect with another being on an intellectual and emotional level was both thrilling and terrifying. Emma finished her work that day and left the chamber as usual, completely unaware that her casual recitation of poetry and personal reflections had profoundly impacted the supposedly sleeping vampire king. She had unknowingly taken the first step toward a connection that would change both of their lives forever. That night, as Alexander rose from his coffin and prepared for his nocturnal activities, he found himself unable to concentrate on his usual duties. His thoughts kept returning to Emma's voice reciting poetry, her thoughtful commentary on loss and hope, and the growing realization that his feelings toward her had moved far beyond mere curiosity or protective interest. Alexander understood that he stood at a crossroads that could alter the course of his immortal existence. He could continue his deception, observing Emma from his supposed slumber while maintaining the emotional distance that had protected him for centuries. Or he could find a way to reveal his ability to remain conscious during daylight hours, opening the possibility for genuine connection while risking everything he had built over his long existence. The vampire king who had ruled with absolute authority for 3 centuries suddenly found himself uncertain about how to proceed. His fate increasingly intertwined with that of a young Irish maid who had no idea of the power she held over the supposedly sleeping monster in the ornate coffin. As winter approached and the days grew shorter, Alexander knew that the delicate balance of his carefully constructed world was about to change forever. Emma's daily presence in his chamber had become both his greatest joy and his most dangerous vulnerability, setting the stage for revelations that would test both of their understanding of trust, courage, and the unexpected connections that can form between the most unlikely beings. November brought an early winter to the mountains, and with it, longer nights that allowed Alexander more time for his nocturnal activities. Yet instead of feeling energized by the extended darkness, he found himself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of Emma and the complicated emotions she had awakened within him. The castle's atmosphere had grown more tense in recent weeks, as reports reached Alexander of growing unrest among the vampire nobles in the surrounding territories. Several younger vampires had begun questioning his leadership, suggesting that 3 centuries of rule had made him complacent and weak. These whispers of rebellion required his attention, yet Alexander found it difficult to focus on political machinations when his thoughts constantly drifted to the Irish Maid, who unknowingly held such power over him. Emma, meanwhile, had begun to notice subtle changes in the castle's daily routine. Servants whispered more frequently in corners, the head butler James seemed more stressed than usual, and even Doctor appeared concerned about something beyond her normal medical duties. The overall atmosphere of unease affected Emma, though she couldn't identify its source. During her daily cleaning of Alexander's chamber, Emma had started bringing small offerings that she hoped might somehow improve his rest. She began placing fresh flowers from the castle's greenhouse near his coffin, believing that pleasant scents might enhance his sleep. She also started opening the curtains slightly wider, allowing more natural light to filter into the room while being careful not to expose his resting place directly to sunlight. These small acts of consideration moved Alexander deeply. He realized that Emma's gestures came from genuine care for his, despite having no expectation of recognition or reward. Her kindness was pure and selfless, qualities that Alexander had not encountered in centuries of dealing with subjects who sought his favor for personal gain. One particularly cold November morning, Emma arrived at Alexander's chamber earlier than usual. She explained to his seemingly sleeping form that she had awakened before dawn with troubling dreams and decided to begin her work early rather than lie awake worrying. As she cleaned, she shared the details of her nightmares, which had involved dark figures threatening the castle and its inhabitants. Alexander listened with growing concern, not just for Emma's peace of mind, but because her dreams eerily paralleled the intelligence reports he had been receiving about potential threats to his kingdom. He wondered if Emma possessed some form of psychic sensitivity that allowed her to sense danger, or if the growing tension in the castle had simply affected her subconscious mind. As Emma worked that morning, she began talking about her growing affection for the castle and its inhabitants. She spoke about how the other servants had become like family to her, how she felt safer within the castle walls than she had anywhere since losing her biological family, and how she had even developed a strange, protective feeling toward Alexander himself. This confession stunned Alexander completely. Emma spoke of feeling sorry for him, imagining how lonely his existence must be, ruling over others while having no one who truly understood or cared for him as a person rather than as a powerful figure. Her empathy and insight into his emotional state were remarkable, especially considering that she believed him to be completely unaware of her words. Emma's monologue continued as she arranged fresh flowers near his coffin. She wondered aloud what Alexander's life had been like before becoming a vampire, whether he had ever experienced love, and whether the burden of immortal leadership had cost him the ability to form genuine connections with others. Her questions and speculations were so perceptive that Alexander felt as if she could see directly into his soul. The most surprising moment came when Emma gently placed her hand on the edge of his coffin and spoke directly to his apparently sleeping form. She told him that she hoped he found peace in his rest, that she would always take care of his chamber with the utmost care, and that she wished she could somehow help ease whatever burdens he carried in his immortal existence. Alexander had to exert enormous self-control to maintain his facade of sleep. Every instinct urged him to open his eyes, sit up, and respond to her extraordinary kindness and understanding. The physical restraint required to remain motionless while emotionally overwhelmed was unlike anything he had experienced in his long existence. After Emma left that morning, Alexander spent the remaining daylight hours in genuine turmoil. Her words had touched something deep within him that he had thought permanently buried under centuries of isolation and necessary cruelty. For the first time since his transformation into a vampire, he questioned whether his chosen path of emotional detachment had been wise or simply cowardly. That evening, Alexander's internal struggle manifested in his interactions with his vampire subjects. During a council meeting with several regional vampire lords, his distraction was obvious. Lord Vincent, a vampire noble who had been particularly vocal in questioning Alexander's recent leadership decisions, openly challenged his authority. Vincent suggested that Alexander's long reign had made him soft and disconnected from the needs of their kind. He proposed that younger, more aggressive leadership might better serve the vampire kingdom in these changing times. Several other vampire lords murmured their agreement, creating the most serious challenge to Alexander's authority in decades. Alexander's response was swift and decisive. His supernatural speed and strength, combined with centuries of combat experience, allowed him to demonstrate his continued dominance without permanently harming his challengers. However, the incident made clear that his distraction over Emma was becoming a liability that his enemies could exploit. The next morning, Emma arrived at Alexander's chamber with news that concerned her greatly. She had overheard Sarah Martinez and another servant discussing rumors of vampire politics and potential threats to the castle. Emma worried aloud about the safety of all the human servants, expressing particular concern about what might happen to them if Alexander's enemies succeeded in any plots against him. Emma's genuine worry for Alexander's, despite her vulnerable position as a human in a vampire's domain, further deepened his emotional conflict. She spoke about how the other servants looked to her for reassurance, having somehow identified her as someone who understood their supernatural employer better than most. This conversation revealed to Alexander that Emma had become an informal leader among the human staff, someone they trusted to gauge Alexander's moods and intentions. He realized that her unique lack of fear toward him had made her a bridge between the human and vampire inhabitants of the castle, a role she had assumed naturally and without seeking any personal advantage. As Emma cleaned that morning, she mentioned finding a book of vampire folklore in the castle's library. She shared her thoughts about the various myths and legends, displaying a surprisingly nuanced understanding of the difference between popular superstitions and likely realities of vampire existence. Her analysis was remarkably accurate, showing that she had given serious thought to understanding the nature of the beings she served. Emma's scholarly approach to vampire lore impressed Alexander greatly. She spoke about vampires not as monsters or demons, but as beings who had been transformed by circumstances beyond their control and had to adapt to a different form of existence. Her perspective was compassionate yet realistic, acknowledging both the supernatural abilities and the inherent challenges of immortal life. Most remarkably, Emma theorized that many of the negative aspects of vampire behavior might stem from loneliness and the psychological trauma of outliving everyone they had ever cared about. She suggested that, if vampires could find ways to form lasting connections and maintain their humanity despite their supernatural nature, they might be capable of greater happiness and less destructive behavior. Alexander was astounded by the accuracy of Emma's psychological insights. Her theories aligned closely with his own experiences and observations over 3 centuries of immortal existence. The fact that a young human woman could develop such understanding through research and empathy demonstrated an intelligence and wisdom that commanded his deepest respect. During the following weeks, Emma's daily visits to Alexander's chamber became increasingly personal and philosophical. She began treating their one-sided conversations as a form of therapy, using the opportunity to work through her own thoughts and feelings while believing herself to be in complete privacy. Emma spoke about her ongoing grief for her lost family, her gratitude for finding safety in the castle, and her growing sense that she had found her true purpose in caring for others, including Alexander himself. She expressed hope that her presence in his chamber brought him some small comfort, even if he remained unaware of her efforts. These conversations revealed Emma's remarkable emotional maturity and spiritual depth. Despite her young age and tragic losses, she had developed a philosophy of life based on service, compassion, and the belief that all beings deserved understanding and care, regardless of their nature or circumstances. Alexander found himself learning from Emma's perspective on existence. Her ability to find meaning and joy despite tremendous personal loss challenged his own cynical worldview, which had been shaped by centuries of political intrigue, betrayal, and the necessity of maintaining power through fear and manipulation. The turning point came on a snowy December morning when Emma arrived at Alexander's chamber in obvious distress. She had received word that vampire lords from distant territories were gathering nearby, and rumors suggested they were planning to challenge Alexander's authority directly. Emma feared that a conflict might endanger all the human servants, including people she had come to love as family. As Emma worked with trembling hands, she began pleading with Alexander's sleeping form to be careful and protect himself. She spoke of how much the castle's human inhabitants depended on his protection, how his death would leave them vulnerable to vampires who might not share his relatively merciful treatment of human servants. Emma's voice broke as she expressed her personal fear of losing him, admitting that she had come to care for him deeply despite the impossibility of any real relationship between them. She confessed that she often imagined what it might be like to have conversations with him, to learn from his centuries of experience, and to offer him the companionship she sensed he needed. Alexander's emotional control finally began to crack as he listened to Emma's heartfelt confession. Her genuine love and concern for him, expressed without any hope of reciprocation or even acknowledgement, touched something in his immortal soul that he had thought permanently lost. The most devastating moment came when Emma knelt beside his coffin and whispered that she would gladly sacrifice her own life to protect him if necessary, because she believed he was fundamentally good despite the dark reputation that surrounded him. She promised to always take care of him, to be worthy of the trust he had shown in allowing her access to his most private spaces. As Emma's tears fell onto the polished wood of his coffin, Alexander realized that his centuries of emotional isolation had ended. He had found someone who could love him not for his power or immortality, but for the person he had been before his transformation and could still become despite his supernatural nature. That afternoon, as Emma finished her work and prepared to leave, she performed an action that would change everything. She leaned down and gently kissed the top of his coffin, whispering a prayer for his protection and expressing her love in the form she could manage while believing him to be unaware of her feelings. Alexander knew that he could no longer maintain his deception. Emma's love and devotion demanded honesty in return, even if revealing his ability to remain conscious during daylight hours meant risking everything he had built over 3 centuries of careful planning and absolute control. The stage was set for a revelation that would test both Emma's courage and Alexander's capacity for vulnerability, as the vampire king who had ruled through fear prepared to open his heart to the one being who had shown him unconditional love. As winter deepened around the castle and political threats gathered like storm clouds, Alexander and Emma stood on the brink of a connection that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, trust, and the possibilities for redemption even in the darkest of circumstances. The December morning that would change everything began like countless others, with Emma entering Alexander's chamber carrying fresh linens and her familiar cleaning supplies. Snow fell heavily outside the castle windows, creating an ethereal silence that seemed to wrap around the ancient stone walls like a protective blanket. Emma moved through her routine with practiced efficiency, but Alexander could sense an underlying tension in her movements. The previous evening had brought disturbing news through the castle's network of servants and informants. The vampire lords who opposed Alexander's rule were gathering strength, and their plans for confrontation were becoming more concrete and dangerous. As Emma worked, she began speaking more urgently than usual about her growing fears for everyone in the castle. She had overheard James, the head butler, discussing emergency protocols with Doctor, and the gravity of their conversation had deeply unsettled her. Emma understood that the human servants were caught in the middle of supernatural politics far beyond their control or understanding. Alexander listened intently as Emma voiced her concerns, noting how her worry focused primarily on the of others rather than her own safety. She spoke about Sarah Martinez's family in Spain, about James' dedication to the castle despite the dangers, and about Doctor's irreplaceable medical knowledge that protected all the human inhabitants. Most significantly, Emma expressed her determination to remain in the castle and continue caring for Alexander, regardless of the political upheaval surrounding them. She declared that she would never abandon him when he might need protection most, even though she acknowledged her limitations as a human facing supernatural threats. This declaration of loyalty moved Alexander profoundly. Emma's willingness to risk her life for his, despite believing their relationship to be entirely one-sided, demonstrated a depth of character that challenged every cynical assumption he had developed over 3 centuries of immortal existence. As Emma knelt to arrange fresh flowers near his coffin, she began sharing something she had never mentioned before. She revealed that she had been secretly researching vampire lore and history, trying to understand Alexander's past and the burdens of immortal leadership. Through her studies, she had discovered references to his mortal life, his transformation, and the tragic circumstances that had led to his current existence. Emma spoke with remarkable accuracy about Alexander's human origins as a medieval nobleman who had tried to protect his people from a plague of supernatural creatures. She had learned how his transformation into a vampire had been not a choice, but a desperate sacrifice, accepting immortal darkness to gain the power necessary to defend those he loved, only to outlive them all and inherit centuries of loneliness. Alexander was stunned by the depth of Emma's research and the accuracy of her conclusions. More importantly, he was moved by her compassionate understanding of his transformation as a heroic sacrifice rather than a fall from grace. Her perspective reframed his entire existence, suggesting that his centuries of rule had been a continuation of his original desire to protect rather than a corruption of his mortal nature. Emma's voice grew softer as she shared her conclusion that Alexander's reputation for ruthlessness was likely a necessary facade, a protective mechanism that allowed him to maintain order in a world where showing weakness would invite disaster. She theorized that underneath the frightening vampire king was still the nobleman who had sacrificed everything to protect others. This insight into his true nature brought Alexander dangerously close to breaking his carefully maintained pretense. Emma had seen through centuries of necessary deception to understand the person he had always remained beneath the supernatural power and political maneuvering. The moment of truth arrived when Emma, believing herself completely alone with Alexander's sleeping form, made a confession that would force him to reveal his secret. She admitted that she had fallen in love with him, not with the powerful vampire king, but with the man she sensed beneath the immortal facade. Emma spoke of her love with heartbreaking honesty, acknowledging the impossibility of their situation while expressing her genuine feelings without reservation. She told his sleeping form that she dreamed of conversations they might have, of moments when he might allow her to see his true self, and of ways she might ease the loneliness that centuries of immortal existence had created. As Emma's confession continued, she reached out and gently touched the side of his face, a gesture so tender and intimate that Alexander's supernatural self-control finally reached its limits. Her touch was warm against his cold skin, and her whispered words of love created an emotional storm that 3 centuries of discipline could no longer contain. Alexander's eyes opened slowly, meeting Emma's startled gaze with an intensity that should have terrified her but somehow didn't. Instead of fear, he saw wonder, confusion, and a courage that matched her earlier declarations of loyalty and love. Emma gasped but did not pull away as Alexander slowly sat up in his coffin, his movements deliberate and careful to avoid frightening her. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the curtains should have been impossible for him to endure, but his unique ability to remain conscious during daylight hours had prepared him for this moment of revelation. For several heartbeats, neither spoke. Emma's hand remained on his face, her green eyes wide with amazement rather than terror. Alexander realized that her love for him had overcome her natural fear of his supernatural nature, just as her understanding of his true character had prepared her for the possibility that he might not be exactly what he appeared. Alexander's first words to Emma were spoken in a voice rough with centuries of disuse during daylight hours. He told her that he had heard every word she had ever spoken in his chamber, that her love and understanding had awakened feelings he thought permanently buried, and that her courage and compassion had given him hope for redemption he had never dared imagine. Emma's response surprised him with its immediacy and certainty. Instead of demanding explanations or expressing betrayal at his deception, she simply said that she had sensed his awareness of her presence and had hoped her words might somehow reach him. Her intuitive understanding of his nature had prepared her for revelations that would have shattered a less perceptive person. Alexander carefully emerged from his coffin, standing before Emma with vulnerability he had not shown to any living being in centuries. He explained his ability to remain conscious during daylight hours, his reasons for maintaining the deception, and his growing emotional dependence on her daily presence in his life. Emma listened without judgment as Alexander shared the loneliness and isolation that had defined his immortal existence. She understood that his political ruthlessness had been necessary survival, that his emotional detachment had been protective rather than cruel, and that her love had offered him the first genuine connection he had experienced since his mortal transformation. Their first real conversation lasted for hours, with Emma asking thoughtful questions about Alexander's experiences and offering insights that demonstrated her remarkable understanding of immortal psychology. Alexander found himself sharing memories, fears, and hopes that he had never expressed to another being, discovering that Emma's love had created a safe space for emotional honesty. As evening approached and Alexander's usual time of awakening arrived, Emma helped him prepare for the political challenges that awaited him. The vampire lords who opposed his rule would soon demand a formal confrontation, and the outcome would determine not only his fate, but the future of everyone in the castle. Emma insisted on playing an active role in preparing for the conflict, despite Alexander's concerns for her safety. She argued that her understanding of his true nature and her unique position among the human servants made her a valuable ally, rather than simply someone to be protected. Together, they developed a strategy that would use Emma's relationships with the castle's inhabitants and her insights into vampire psychology to strengthen Alexander's position. Her love had given him emotional strength, but her intelligence and courage would prove equally valuable in the battles ahead. The transformation of their relationship from secret observation to genuine partnership created a new dynamic in the castle. Emma continued her duties as Alexander's personal maid, but now their interactions carried the weight of mutual love and shared purpose. Other servants noticed subtle changes in both Emma and Alexander, though none suspected the true nature of their connection. Emma seemed more confident and purposeful, while Alexander displayed a warmth and consideration that surprised everyone who interacted with him. Doctor was the first to guess that something significant had changed. Her medical training had taught her to observe subtle behavioral changes, and she correctly identified signs of a deep emotional connection between Emma and Alexander. However, her discretion and loyalty prevented her from discussing her observations with others. James, as head butler, also noticed the changes, but interpreted them differently. He assumed that Emma's exceptional service had earned Alexander's particular favor, which explained the obvious improvement in the Vampire King's mood and treatment of the human staff. The approaching confrontation with the rebellious vampire lords would test both Alexander's political skills and his newfound emotional strength. Emma's love had given him something to fight for beyond mere survival, while her understanding of his true nature had restored his belief in his own capacity for goodness. As winter deepened and the final confrontation approached, Alexander and Emma prepared to face their enemies together. Their love had transformed them both, giving the immortal vampire king a reason to hope for the future and providing the mortal maid with a purpose that transcended her own mortality. The revelation of Alexander's consciousness during daylight hours had destroyed the barriers between them, creating a partnership that would challenge the supernatural world's understanding of possible relationships between vampires and humans. Their connection had begun with her compassionate service and his secret observation, but it had evolved into something that neither the mortal nor immortal realms had ever witnessed. Emma's courage in loving what she believed to be a sleeping monster had awakened the humanity that Alexander thought lost forever. Alexander's willingness to reveal his deepest secret had shown Emma that her love was returned with an intensity that transcended the boundaries between mortal and immortal existence. Together, they stood ready to face whatever challenges their enemies might present, knowing that their love had already achieved the impossible by bridging the gap between two entirely different forms of existence. The vampire king who had ruled through fear had learned to lead through love, while the Irish maid who had sought only to serve had become a queen in all but name. The dark castle that had once been a fortress of isolation had become a sanctuary of connection, proving that even the most unlikely love could transform the most hardened hearts. Alexander's pretense of slumber had ended, but their real story was just beginning, as they prepared to show the world that love could indeed conquer even the darkness between mortal and immortal souls. Their future remained uncertain, filled with political dangers and supernatural challenges, but Emma and Alexander faced it together, their bond forged in secrecy and strengthened by truth, ready to prove that love truly could illuminate even the deepest darkness.